Alright, so I wanted to make a video about the murder of Henry Nowak, which is becoming especially topical and relevant given what's been happening recently in Southampton, because once again, we're now seeing an outbreak of rioting. Although it seems that for the time being, this time the riots are largely contained to a particular area. They appear to have happened in Southampton, which is the city where Henry Nowak was killed. And as far as I'm aware, they haven't spread to any other areas of the UK. So it's, ever since Southport in the summer of 2024, it's becoming more and more of a trend that we're seeing heated, angry protests and sporadic outbreaks of violence, which tend to be happening around the summertime each year. And last year we saw an outbreak of rioting in Ballymena in Northern Ireland, and later that year we also saw some riots in Epping Forest in Essex and London over the sentencing of Hadush Kabatu. It's really interesting because just going back a decade, I was already anti-mass immigration back then, but I never actually thought that the British would start rioting. I heard people warning about this in some of their YouTube channels, and even then I was dismissive. I was incredibly black-pilled and thinking, God, I don't think that will happen. I don't think it's in our character. Well, just look. I mean, this is becoming a tradition now. It's becoming part and parcel of living in modern Britain. So anyway, I do not condone the riots. Honestly, yeah, I've seen all those memes. I've seen those memes of people chucking bins at the police. I've seen the memes of those wheelie bins floating around Twitter. I think some of them are hilarious. But remember, behind the uniform, and I understand the police as an institution, they are vile and corrupt, and they are partly responsible for the death of Henry Nowak. But behind the uniform, there are ordinary individuals trying to keep the peace there. And by the way, I have a cousin who works for Hampshire and the Isle of Wight police, and it's highly likely he's probably involved in keeping the peace. There's no way he hasn't heard of this. He's probably been drilled about it. He's seen the body cam footage and everything. At some point, I'm thinking I might sit down and have a chat with him at Wetherspoons and hear his opinion. But anyway, I want to talk specifically about the killing of Henry Nowak, and I want to talk about the surrounding discussion about why it's so shocking and what this means for the future of multicultural Britain. Because I feel like there's a key point that I need to discuss that's especially pertinent to the case, and it's about religious exemptions and the right to carry knives in public, because this seems to be the focal point of everyone's discussion. I go on Twitter and I often see people talking about this. Why is it that there's a religious minority in this country that are allowed to go around carrying knives on their person when we're not allowed to carry knives? Like, that doesn't make sense. Like, either everyone should be allowed to go around carrying knives or no one should. Just make it make sense. And on the face of it, I agree. I do think it is a little absurd and unfair. It reeks of a double standard. The idea that there's a religious minority who are allowed to go around carrying a lethal weapon on their person if we're not. Personally, I take the view that we should just allow people to go around carrying what they want, but they should conduct themselves responsibly. And we should stop being so quick to assume that anyone carrying a lethal weapon on their person, or even a replica, because I remember reading this absurd, ridiculous story only recently where this man was arrested for carrying a replica of a Nintendo weapon. If you can believe that. They've banned ninja swords in London, for Christ's sake. I've already told you about the story how I went into a shop in Newport and bought some disposable razors, and I was told that I needed to show my ID for that. You can't even buy a normal knife on Amazon without identification due to the Southport riots. Truly, we live in a clown world. late-stage liberalism society. So anyway, it makes no sense. Just on the principle of the thing, why is it that they are allowed to carry knives and we're not? And the discussion sort of devolved into a diatribe about the Sikh community and other religious minorities, and how we should not tolerate this kind of double standard in our society. Now, I don't necessarily disagree. I do think that if we are at all to allow and tolerate this religious minority to go around carrying symbolic knives, we should at least make sure that the knives are not lethal. They can't be used to do harm to anyone. But there's but a couple of things I ought to say. First of all, it's broadly true that of all the religious minorities we have in this country, Sikhs are some of the least troublesome. And this is true. I'm not saying that they're perfect. I'm not even saying that I want there to be a Sikh community in this country. But anyway, it's just, let's not get ahead of ourselves and ignore basic proportionality and crime statistics. But there is a whole discussion that everyone's lost sight of here. This is not a simple matter of religious exemptions and double standards. This is about race and ethnicity. It's always been about race and ethnicity, and it always will be. Because, first of all, we're never going to understand the true underlying motivational factors as to why Henry Nowak was targeted of all people. You know, it's just, we can speculate till the cows come home, but in the context of modern multicultural Britain, where so many attacks are coloured by the racial dimensions of the perpetrator and the victim, you know, like the Southport killings, does anyone think it was a coincidence that Axel Rudakabana was a black second-generation African immigrant, and all of his victims that he targeted were young white English girls? Does anyone think it's a coincidence, or it's by accident, that all the victims of the Rotherham, Rochdale, Telford, Halifax rape gangs, the facts of which are only beginning to come out now due to Rupert Lowe's impending rape gang inquiry, does anyone think it's all the victims, for whom, by the way, certainly the vast majority of them are young, white and English, and the perpetrators, the majority of which are South Asian and practicing Muslim? Is it not a stretch of the imagination to assume that this could have factored into why Henry Nowak was targeted in the first place? But more to the point, the moment shortly after Vikram brutally stabbed this young lad to death, what happened? Well, what happened was Vikram and his family all collectively conspired to weaponize our own middle-class sensitivities against us and game the system and trick us into thinking that they had been the victims of a racist attack. It's absolutely astonishing. If you watch the body cam footage, in a way, you almost sympathize with the police because everyone in the family is in on it. They all corroborate one another's stories. When the police arrive at the murder scene, it's not evident to them that Henry's been stabbed because the murder weapon's missing. It's been hidden by the murderer's mother. They all lie to cover one another. Vikram constantly interrupts and says, no, he hasn't been stabbed. And he points to his own face and say, I got punched in the face. I've got a bruise up here. My turban's been ripped off. See, it's just, on first impressions can be misleading. But if you were in that situation, it might take a while for the reality to sink in. And I'm not necessarily judging. I'm not necessarily taking the side of the police here. I do think the police acted absolutely unprofessionally, and there needs to be a reckoning for what they've done. But basically, this hints at a wider problem, doesn't it? Why is it that this family of second-generation immigrants, why are they so quick to take the side of their son who's just committed murder the moment he explains the situation to them? Why do they not demand that he turn himself in? And And why is it that they're allowed to freely converse with one another in Punjabi? This is another thing that was recorded in the story, that Vikram and his brother were conversing with one another in their own native language. Do we get the overall impression that this family, this second generation family of Indian Sikhs, do we really consider that to be British behavior? And here the conversation departs into something that a lot of people don't want to go into. It morphs into something that few people like to acknowledge, and that is the fact that there are different ethnic and racial groups all vying for dominance in modern multicultural Britain, and that some of them have gotten wise to the fact that our institutions are institutionally discriminatory and prejudiced against white British people, or in this case, white people at all, because Henry Nowak was Polish. And this, in my opinion, herein lies the true crux of the problem. There was racial animus that took place behind this murder. The discussion of whether religious minorities should be exempted from laws on wielding knives in public, in my view, that's not even relevant. The fact of the matter is, this racial and religious minority willfully exploited our good, trusting nature and the do-gooding nature of our police force, who all took the knee for George Floyd and who they've rolled out this, ever since the Macpherson inquiry, they've all committed themselves to be anti-racist, and they sought to take advantage of that in order to commit murder, and they almost got away with it. They almost got away with it. And this is why when we hear accusations against the Sikh community, and we hear declarations and apologies from the Sikh community, I'm afraid none of this is going away anytime soon. There should not be a British Indian community. There should not be a British Sikh community. There should not be any hyphenated Brits. And some of you guys are going to scowl at me for this. Some of you are going to think that it's callous and insensitive of me to say this. And by the way, I want you to understand, I feel deeply angry over the death of this young lad. He had a bright future ahead of him. I never would have wished any kind of harm to come onto him, but I don't even feel easy about there being a British-Polish community either. It's just, there should only be one community, and that is the British community. There should not be any hyphenated Brits. This in itself is the source of all the division. We are an innately tribal species. We like to form bonds and communities based on our own ancestral, historic, and our own ties and our own personal preferences. And some people are more closely connected than others. That's just the way things are. Modern multicultural Britain, multiculturalism by itself it's a nonsensical idea. This idea that we can artificially engineer our own societies through mass immigration and through state propaganda to create a new culturally homogeneous population who all believe in the same values and abstractions together. This was the main sort of delusion. This was the liberal delusion that plagued all of us in the latter half of the 20th century, certainly by the 90s and the early 2000s. And it's only now that we're beginning to witness cases like this, although there have been others before it. It's only now that we're beginning to be exposed to the brutal realities that not everyone shares our individual liberal tendencies, that not everyone interprets social dynamics and different human interactions the same way we do. Not everyone imbibes Christian values like we do. Not everyone conducts themselves in the same ways that we do. We are inherently different. And this matters. This is especially relevant because we're different in ways that make us vulnerable to people who are not like us, to people who are more ethnocentric, to people who are who are willing to band together and unify against a different tribe in accordance with their own values. And that is the fundamental nature of the problem. That's why when you hear about the counter-jihad movement, there are civic nationalists who try to misrepresent the nature of racist attacks or attacks by minorities against Brits, anti-white attacks. They misrepresent it as if to say that Islam is the biggest problem, that it's Muslims who are the only problem. And if only there was no Islam, if only all the Muslims were gone, if only the Muslims were forced to embrace British values and Britishness, then all this would go away. Well, I'm afraid this entire murder case and several others like it have decisively blown a hole in that theory. People are now beginning to see the ugly truth. As long as there are different groups living in the same living space as one another, there will always be division. There will always be inequality. It is ideologically incoherent that these foreign groups are allowed to practice and celebrate their own cultural heritage, even go around adorned with these lethal weapons on their persons, but we are not allowed any of that. It has taken decades for ordinary working class Brits to awaken to this reality, to the inherent contradictions of multiculturalism, and so many young lives have been snuffed out as a result. People like Chris Donald, people like what's his name, Kenneth Blakelock, people like Yvonne Fletcher. So many young lives were brutally stolen away in the context of this multicultural liberal fever dream, this delusion, this state-imposed delusion. And it's only now, although I predict this will not be the last one, there will be many other sacrifices to this utopian multiculturalism before the people finally wake up and discard this completely asymmetric, one-sided ideological tyranny upon us. And for the record, I want to say I don't have any personal hatred against Sikhs as individuals. I've met many individuals who are from ethnic minority backgrounds, and I tend to treat people as individuals based on their own merits, and I can't help it because that's just the way I am. But I do have a problem with these people in groups. I have a problem with the fact that they exist as groups who can lobby for their own interests. Like, there should not be a British Muslim community. British Muslim in itself should be an oxymoron. British Sikh should be an oxymoron. We have been so ideologically captured by liberalism, we've completely forgotten what it means to assimilate. So what does it actually mean to assimilate? Well, one can only be said to have assimilated when one is visually, audibly, and culturally completely, totally indistinct from the majority population. That is what it means to assimilate. I'll give you an example of so many people who have assimilated. So in the history of the British Isles, Ireland is a country that's positioned right next to Britain, and we have thousands of years worth of history of us trying to conquer them, and immigration and back and forth between Ireland and Britain. And there have been many points in our history where Irish people have come over here and settled in our towns and cities. And there were flashpoints at many times, especially during the 19th and 20th century, where there were concerns over Irish immigrations, and people would hold up signs saying things like "no blacks, no dogs, no Irish." But is there a major concern that the Irish are coming over to take over? Like, is there an Irish racial consciousness? There might have been something akin to that in the 1970s and 1980s with the IRA and all the bombings. But on the other hand, given Ireland's geographic and cultural proximity to us Brits, given the fact that the vast majority of Irish people speak English as a first language, given the fact that they are Christian, given the fact that they are visually indistinct from us, although many of them have ginger hair, there is no widespread movement to deport all Irish people from Britain, is there? I mean, think of how many British people exist nowadays who have some Irish heritage, Irish ancestry. I'm told that I'm partly descended from the Irish on my mother's side. But do I consider myself Irish? Of course not. For one, I'm not a practicing Catholic. Two, I don't speak a word of Gaelic. And three, I've literally only been over and visited that place once. I'm not Irish at all. I don't consider myself Irish in the slightest. And I'm sure if I went round to Ireland and asked locals there, I think they would agree with me. I'm an Englishman. I always have been. I'm 100% English. There is just no ambiguity about it in my family tree and in my blood and in my bones. I am spiritually an Englishman. And that is what it means to be English. That's what it means to be British. And there are many people who historically may have had family or relatives from Ireland, but the Irishness doesn't really exist anymore because they've assimilated. Another example, and this is something that will really blow your mind, and this is something that blew me away when I first found out about it, and it's about America. So, America is a majority white population, and as you know, the majority of white Americans are historically, they trace their ancestry back to Europe. But has anyone ever taken a moment to wonder what the majority country or majority region of it is that most white Americans trace their ancestry back to? You guys are going to be amazed by this if you don't know. It's not British. It's not English, by the way. Even though all the founding fathers were English or Scottish, even though the Pilgrim Fathers and the Mayflower generation, even though they were English, even though America as a country, in its constitutional framework and legal system, it is very culturally similar to Britain and England, where is it that most white Americans trace their ancestry back to? You guys are going to be, absolutely, your mind is going to be blown when you hear the answer. It's not British, it's not Irish, it's not Italian, it's German. That's right. The majority of white Americans are German. This is something that amazes me because Germans were never there in the beginning of America's history as a founding nation. None of the founding fathers were German. Germans weren't around until the 19th century when they started coming over as immigrants and as pioneers, mainly to settle in the Midwest region as farmers, to build their own homestead. And the things they had to endure there, they faced widespread discrimination and prejudice. This is in spite of the fact that they were white Europeans. Yeah, people have said, are Irish people really white? Are the Italians really white? These were Germans. They were as white as the Anglo-Saxons. And they were still not considered true Americans. They faced abuse. They faced institutional prejudice and discrimination. And in fact, the amount of discrimination and isolation that they faced was so strong that they had no choice but to discard their German heritage and adopt their new identity as Americans. And they did this so effectively that you wouldn't believe that this was possible. First of all, their children were raised to speak English. None of them spoke German at their house. To my knowledge, there are no pockets of human remnant population anywhere in America where they speak any trace of German. I've heard that apparently that there are some places where they do, but it's a very small minority. I think there are some places where they speak Pennsylvanian Dutch or something like that. Like the Amish, they speak of dialect of Dutch. But Americans speak English. German is not spoken as a second language, or even a third, or a fourth, or a fifth. Like, it doesn't register culturally. And not just that, not only does no one in America speak German, but America, the majority of whose ethnic constituents trace their lineage back to Germany, America went to war against Germany twice, against its own historic motherland. How is this possible? How is this possible when you consider that most Americans are historically German? And not just that, the Americanization of the German diaspora was so intense. The discrimination and abuse they face, and suspicion they faced from the from the Americans who lived there, was to such an extent that they decided to anglicize their last names. They got rid of their German-sounding last names and transformed them into English-sounding names. And there's so many examples of this. I mean, off the top of my head, there was this American country music duo called the Louvain Brothers, or the Loudermilk Brothers, Charles and Ira Loudermilk. Don't ask me how I found out about this. It was just random curiosity. But Loudermilk, like, what the hell kind of name is that? Why is it that there are so many Americans in flyover country with weird-sounding last names that don't make any sense? I'll tell you why. It's because their names were historically German names, but they were anglicized to sound more English. And Loudermilk is one example, because it was originally, their last name was something like Lautermilch, which in German means pure white milk. And they changed it to Loudermilk. Also, in the film Back to the Future, we learned that Dr. Emmett Brown, his family's name was originally Von Braun. And you might think that it's unfair. You know, it's never nice, it's never pleasant when a whole community has to shed their ethnic identity, their own sense of kinship, and trade it for a different one. One might even call it ethnic cleansing or genocide, but that is exactly what the Germans did. And in that respect, the Germans assimilated. The Germans completely did away with their own German identity and adopted Americanism. They became true Americans. Another example, the Huguenots. I mean, are there any existing Huguenots that exist in modern Britain now? Of course not. There's no trace to say that the Huguenots were ever there, because they came over to this country throughout the generations. They adopted the religion of the ascendant Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture. They sent their children to English schools. They completely discarded their original French language, and in so doing, they assimilated. And the reason why I went into this whole big spiel about immigration and assimilation is because that is what liberalism has completely deluded us. It's deluded us into thinking that we can have a resident minority population who can trace their ancestry to a foreign land and be ethnically conscious of the fact, and we can still kid ourselves into thinking that they have assimilated. But that's not what true assimilation is. And this is the true bone of contention with the Digwa family and Indian Sikhs. For a Sikh, a British Indian or a British Sikh family is itself an oxymoron. It's something that it's a delusion that can only be maintained and sustained in the context of ideological, state-sponsored multiculturalism. And it's taken, tragically for us, it's taken this tragic, brutal murder of Henry Nowak to make us realize this, to make us understand how a whole population of people historically having been from a different country, they can claim to be assimilated, but in reality, they will still be resident foreigners. Oh, and I didn't even get into the fact that we have gypsies and Irish travellers. Does anyone think that they're British? I certainly don't. And I'm not even going to get into that discussion because, frankly, there's no discussion to be had. Anyway, God, I certainly went on longer than I thought I would. But anyway, this has been Tracking. I hope that this video won't be taken down by YouTube. Some of the opinions I've expressed may be considered brutal and unfair, but nonetheless, these are my sincerely held beliefs. And do you agree or disagree? Let me know in the comments. This has been Tracking. You guys take care.